When it comes to stubborn belly fat, what is the optimal way of training that will help you to not only lose that fat that's found under the skin or subcutaneous fat, but also help you to lose the most amount of visceral or the more dangerous fat that's found inside the organs and around the organs? Let's take a look at that data. But before we dive in, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, that subscribe button, and I would love to hear your comments below. Before we dive into the research, it's important to define what metabolic syndrome is because that's exactly what this study was testing. In order to have metabolic syndrome, you need to have 3 of the following 5 criteria. That criteria is having central obesity, which means your waist circumference greater than 35 inches in women or greater than 40 inches in men. Having elevated triglycerides that are greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter. Having HDL that's less than 40 milligrams per deciliter in men or less than 50 milligrams per deciliter in women. Having high blood pressure that's greater than 130 over 85 millimeters of mercury. And lastly, having elevated blood sugars that are fasting greater than 100 milligrams per deciliter. So those are the 5 criteria. And if you have 3 of those, you're classified as having metabolic syndrome. Now let's look at a really interesting study in which they randomly assign people into 3 arms to ask the question of what type of exercise causes the most amount of weight loss, specifically fat loss, both subcutaneous and visceral. In the study design, they had 27 middle-aged women. Now, these were women ages about 51 or so, give or take 9 years, but they all had metabolic syndrome. So that means they all had a higher risk of developing things like diabetes, heart disease, etc. They broke these participants down into 3 groups. And in those 3 groups, they essentially had the first arm, which was the control arm, where they weren't given any exercise prescription. The second arm was the low-intensity exercise arm. In this arm, they had them exercise 5 days per week. And the way they determine what's low intensity is they measured their blood test to see when they would hit something called the lactate threshold. Essentially, when they would start to produce lactate in their blood. And they made sure that they would have them exercise below this level. And so 5 days per week, they were doing low-intensity exercise. And essentially, they were following this Borg's rating of perceived exertion scale, or RPE scale. And they were aiming for about a 10 to 12 scale out of 20 possible. So 10 to 12 out of 20. On the high-intensity interval training, they had them also train 5 days per week. But for 3 days, they had them go intense exercise. Now, what's intense? It was above their lactate threshold and below their VO2 max, or essentially complete all-out effort. So somewhere in between. On the Borg scale of rating of perceived exertion, they were running anywhere between 15 to 17. So low intensity was RPE of about 10 to 12. High intensity was RPE of about 15 to 17. Now on the remaining 2 days out of the training, they had them do just low intensity exercise training. So 5 days total, 3 days of high intensity, 2 days of low intensity. So what did they find? Well, the first finding was looking at just waist circumference, measuring it. And what they found was that the highest reduction in waist circumference was in the high intensity exercise arm. And it was significant both from their baseline and significantly lower compared to the low intensity exercise group and of course the control group. Then when they looked at abdominal fat, they saw the same exact thing. With the abdominal fat, there was a significantly greater reduction. And remember, they used CT scans here to be able to measure the amount of fat that was present. So using scans, they were able to see how much fat was there. So the abdominal fat was significantly reduced in the high-intensity arm. Same thing with the subcutaneous fat. Now, when they looked at the high-intensity arm for visceral fat, even though there was a marked reduction, it didn't quite reach significance there. Now moving on to VO2 max, as expected, both the low intensity and the high intensity had a significant increase in their VO2 max. That means that their cardiorespiratory fitness increased with exercise, that's expected. Of course, with the high intensity exercise arm, there was a significant increase simply because of the fact that high intensity causes you, 1, to improve your VO2 max, and 2, it can actually do it pretty fast. Now, coming back to this issue of abdominal visceral fat. So when they looked at abdominal visceral fat, the only significance that they saw was really in the pre and post in the high intensity arm. The other arms didn't quite reach that significant status. So what it says basically is even though the drop in visceral fat compared from high intensity to low intensity wasn't significant, but in the group of participants in the high intensity arm, those that started the study to where they ended the study, they had a significant drop in their visceral fat. So what are the limitations of this study before we apply the results? Well, first thing is they weren't looking at dietary records. So as a result, it is possible that the folks in the high intensity arm, they had the most calorie deficit, and that's why you saw the fat loss. It's possible, but unlikely. They also, RPE is subjective. So the rate of or rating for perceived exertion can be very subjective in the sense that if I don't feel like giving it my all today, I can tell the researchers that, hey, I really feel like I'm 16 or 17 on the RPE scale, even though I may not be working as hard. So there's a subjective nature to RPE, and that can affect the outcomes. And lastly, there's some thought that maybe a multi-slice CT could have been better than a single slice, but for the sake of this study, the single slice still gave very good outcomes and is able to give us the data that we want to come up with some conclusions. So what are those conclusions and what is the takeaway bottom line here? First, high intensity training is better for both subcutaneous and visceral fat loss. Now, you don't have to do it every single day because if you did it, it's easy to get burned out. But 3 times per week, 2 times per week, alternating days can work absolutely wonders. And if you combine this with a whole foods plant-based diet, you have the ideal recipe to become healthier, to get rid of that stubborn belly fat, and to make sure that you're making choices that are not just good for you, for your children, but also for the environment. As always, thanks so much for watching. I'd really appreciate it if you would smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share, and I would love to hear your comments below. Thanks so much.